welcome to our last session before lightning talks this afternoon. If you're not sure, it is Saturday afternoon. Please welcome Felipe. Whoa, please say farewell to me. Please welcome Felipe Tavares, who's here to talk about Wi-Fi. Is it just blinking lights? Wi-Fi, RF, other kinds of dark arts. Please welcome Felipe.
Hello, everyone. So let's just get a quick introduction through. I do a bit of statistics and testing at a company called Morse Micro. We design Wi-Fi chips, but it's not your conventional Wi-Fi. It's actually Wi-Fi Halo, which is basically a longer range, lower power version of Wi-Fi, basically for embedded devices. I have a blog where you can read about my ramblings. I also do a bit of pixel art on the side. You can look at that. And if you're on Fediverse, you can find me there. All right. This would be the updated title of the talk. Risky demos of unproven technology I hacked together in the kitchen yesterday. And just a picture of what that looked like. That was me in my apartment room, making sure things worked just before the talk. All right, so let's cover the statement of the talk, right? Is Wi-Fi just blinking lights? So let's talk about light for a second. The basis of light is something called a photon. This little guy there with a cool hat because he goes fast. So the way light works is, depending on the different kinds of light that you have something called wavelength, which basically describes how fuzzy the light is. And of course, light is always going at the speed of light. You have all of these different kinds of light. You have light that's used in Wi-Fi Halo, which is like about 30 centimeters in that fuzziness. You have light that's used on 2.4 gigahertz Wi-Fi, which is your standard Wi-Fi, and that's about 88 centimeters. And then if you go all the way down and further down and further down in size, you finally have visible light, which is much, much, much smaller, about 550 nanometers. But yes, it's all light. The light that's used in your phone to communicate with the cell towers, light that's used on ham radios, and light that you can see, all photons. And of course, light has a bit of a relationship with frequency, which is basically just, it's the inverse of the time that it takes for the photon to move that wavelength amount. All right, so we have established that Wi-Fi is in fact light, and a lot of other things are light as well. But what exactly is Wi-Fi? So Wi-Fi is defined by this standard called Data 211 standard, which defines a bunch of things, and over the years it just has been added and added and added to, and every time you see a new release of something, Wi-Fi 4, Wi-Fi 5, Wi-Fi 6, Wi-Fi 7, it goes on, and every time it's just a bunch of new things that gets added to the same old standard called Data 211. And at its core, that standard basically defines, there's something called the physical layer, which basically defines how do we generate light, how do we see that light, how that light behaves in general. And then there's something called the medium access layer, which basically defines how we control the chaos that's generated by trying to communicate just with light pulses and blinking lights. So if we were to break down what is happening when you're using some Wi-Fi device to communicate, you basically have your browser that's doing something there, and it's sending something to the kernel of the operating system, and that goes through the driver, which basically generates 802.11 frames, which is the data unit that's used when you're using any Wi-Fi technology. That gets communicated to whatever Wi-Fi hardware you have by any kind of bus that can be multiple different protocols. In this case, I just exemplified there with USB bus. And finally, your Wi-Fi chip is going to do some magic, and it's plugged to an antenna, and you get some light. And finally, and this is the most complicated bit, what exactly are we saying when we say Wi-Fi is blinking lights? Why say blinking? It's a very specific kind of blinking, and I'm going to cover a quick example of how that blinking pattern would behave if you were to send something over blinking lights, somewhat in a Wi-Fi standard for Pycon AU, for example. If we take the P that is represented by some ASCII number, so it's there in binary, 8 bits, and then the first thing that we do is basically split that in two. So we get the first part, which is just 5, the second one is 0. And then we represent that in multiple different ways, but people in the RF space usually like to do it in one very specific way, which is this. They create a Cartesian plane, and they just say, I'm going to put the 5 on one of the axes and the 0 on the other one. So they split the information into two, and one goes to the x-axis, the other one goes into y-axis. One of these points is whatever information you want to send. However, this is just a preference from the people that work with this thing. If you wanted, you could represent in a number of ways. You could use a complex number, which has 2 parts. You assign 5 to one of them, 0 to the other one. Doesn't matter which direction. You could use a vector. Anything that has 2 components would do it just fine. But the important thing here is actually that when you want to send that as light, there is an interesting property that you can use, which is basically if you have something that is oscillating in a sine wave and something that's oscillating in a cosine wave, they are something that we call orthogonal. That means you can mix them together and then unmix them apart, and you can still retrieve the information from both sides. So what you can do is if you want to send the 5 and 0 from earlier, which if you combine them together represents the P in Pycon, what you can do is just have one of these sides multiply a sine wave, and the other one multiply a cosine wave, mix them together, and then through the magic of mathematics, you get them both back together on the other end. And that's how the blinking is done in Wi-Fi. So essentially, instead of just playing on-off blinkings, it's actually more of a multiple different levels blinking. And this thing is called quadrature amplitude modulation. Quadrature because it actually, this property where you have sines and cosines can be mixed together and unmixed is basically a 90-degree phase difference, and that's called a quadrature. Amplitude, because when you multiply things by different values, you're basically making them smaller or bigger. So amplitude. And modulation, because anything that's being used to generate waves in this sense is a modulation scheme. I'll just cover a bit of encryption, because on Wi-Fi technologies, all right, you can have the sequence of bytes, you can convert them to something, and then send them through an antenna. All good and all fine. However, very often you do want to do that secretly or with some encryption slapped on. So I'll just cover really quickly what the core principle of encryption is. I won't go too in depth, but it's just enough to get anyone curious. So what is encryption? When we say something is encrypted, are you making it garbled? Are you hiding something? Is it some magic that you do that only allows you to see the result and nobody else? It's actually random, pseudo-random to be precise. And the core principle is just if you have a sequence of numbers, let's call them B1, B2, B3, whatever, and you have a sequence of random numbers, R1, R2, R3, what you can do is just sum every single number with every single random number, and the result is also a random number. Let's say that I had 3, and then someone gives me a random number. I sum that to 3, and then I tell the result to someone. They can't tell that I had 3 initially because I summed with a random number. It could be anything, right? So that's the fundamental principle of encryption. And the way that this actually works is you have these things called pseudo-random number generators that can take a seed. And that essentially means that they generate a infinite sequence of pseudo-random numbers that you can just add to bytes, and that's your encrypted traffic. So if you actually looked at what bytes are being transferred in encrypted traffic, is all random bytes. One of the big issues in making things secure is making sure that random is actually close to actual random, so close that you cannot actually use any techniques to retrieve information from that. All right. And now is the part of the talk where I do what Matt didn't in the talk before, and I'm going to show you a demo of how all of this stuff works, interestingly enough, using MicroPython. So it's a nice complement. So the idea here is pretty simple. You have all of this stuff. You can generate all of these waves that somewhat are analog to Wi-Fi. And can you actually do it, though? Can you actually do something that is doing some communication using this quadrature amplitude modulation stuff and sending some information over as light? And can you actually see how that light behaves instead of just being invisible hocus pocus light that nobody can see? The plan for that is using a Raspberry Pi Pico, which you can flash with MicroPython, and then adding some LEDs to generate light on that, and then some light-sensitive resistors to actually detect that light on the other end. And we want to send some information over, and you want to see what it looks like. And because I like to make things very complicated when they could be very simple, I actually built this out of individual LEDs. I could just have used a normal RGB LED, but I actually slapped together 3 LEDs, one of each color, just for the fun of it. Very good soldering practice skills. And then I did the same thing for all the LDRs, and that's for detecting the light that's coming out of those LEDs. The problem is, though, I actually wanted to detect what color was that light on, because for the fun of it, I wanted to do all of those schemes on top of some color modulation. I wanted to see some color going around. So how do you do that? These guys can only basically detect light, but they can't say, okay, which color is that? So, I went to Officeworks looking for some filters, and they had these in there. And what happened next was murder. And that's what I get. Very nice filtered light-sensitive resistors. However, it didn't go too according to plan. So what you guys are seeing here is basically for every single combination that I can have with those RGB LED that I created slapping together different LEDs on the x-axis, this is the response that I get from the different LDRs. So one of them is pretty good. That blue one seems to pick up some frequency. The yellow one, also pretty good, seems to peak around somewhere. However, that red one and the yellow one are pretty similar, so they are not really picking up different things, and that's because blue and green are really similar. Even computers are confused as to what is blue and what is green. However, we don't care too much about that because they are just dissimilar enough that we can sort of reconstruct the original color of the light from that. So the plan is we get some information, in this case just some random bits. We do some quadrature amplitude modulation, which just means I multiply cosines and sines, and then I generate something out of that. And then I want to send that as different colors. And to do that, basically I can set up all the different colors that you can see as a single spectrum, and I can just sweep through that spectrum according to my wave, and that's going to generate a bunch of colors. I can detect that on the other end, and I can figure out what the original information that was sent was in the first place. Demo time. Let's hope this works. So what I have here is I actually put all of that microcontroller stuff inside my bag because it's nice and dark in there, probably quite warm as well. They probably like that. And I put a camera in there. Now, if this works, we should just be able to see inside my bag what's going on. All right. And my program here is just a quick MicroPython program that does a couple things. First, it tries to calibrate the medium, because if I do this inside my bag, it's going to be different. If I do it outside somewhere, it's going to be different in every single place. So I'm just going to run every single color, and I'm going to register what the response is, what's happening with those different frequencies of light. And that's going to calibrate the system so it knows what is what. And after that, I'm going to do something where I send a couple bits at a time. And so instead of the example that we had with like 4 bits, like a 8-bit number from like the P in Pycon being split into 4-bit numbers, and then that being translated into 2 sine waves, what I'm going to do is just use a 2-bit number, and then 1 bit goes into each one of the axes, which means that it can be either one side or the other side. Same for the other axis, one side or the other side. That leaves us with basically 4 different points. So it's just a 2-bit number that's being transferred. Let's see what it looks like. All right, that's the calibration. And now it's sending stuff. And then I wrote a quick program to actually visualize what's happening there in a nice way. And hopefully this works. All right. So what we should be seeing here is basically each one of the 4 different configurations. So basically each one of the 4 different edges of a square being read by the LDRs in here, and that's going to be one of each one of the 4 corners. You can see there is a lot of variation. It's floating around a lot, but it does follow corner to corner to corner to corner. So this, what you're seeing here at the bottom, is what Wi-Fi would look like if you could actually see it. And then back to the slides. All right. There are a couple things that I sort of glossed over in this. They're a bit more complicated. And 2 that didn't make it, they are particularly important in actually making Wi-Fi work, are OFDM and interference. OFDM is just a way of, instead of having this, let's say, 2 bits of information being transferred at a time, you have multiple channels of those happening at the same time. So you could have 8 different channels, each one 2 bits across, all of them being sent at the same time. And the way that that's being done is by separating out different frequencies of light and creating different channels from those. The end result of that is that everything basically looks like a buzzing mess, because there's just like so much information being transferred across such a large range of different waves of light. But it's the main reason that Wi-Fi works so well and you can get so much data through. The second thing that's pretty important is interference. There is a lot in there. I cannot go into detail into any depth, but basically the thing is there is not a single just a single Wi-Fi device in here, for example, or a single radio device. There are multiple different devices with multiple different protocols. For example, Wi-Fi and Bluetooth live with each other and they use the same frequencies. So all of this stuff, you need to come up with ways of making sure people are not talking over each other, and still you get data through. And other than that, there is a million other things that are also important in Wi-Fi, from understanding how the chips are made and all the analog magic that goes into making RF chips and a bunch of other things. And that's it. I'll take some questions now.
All right. Please thank Felipe. All right, yeah, we have heaps of time for questions. So please put your hands up. Preferably up the back so I get to like walk closer to the fresh air.
How is signal attenuation like calibrated for in the real world? Because when like things move, like the amplitude changes, right?
Yep. So remember that thing that I talked about just now called OFDM that allows you to send multiple different signals at the same time? Yeah. What you can do is send known signals. So you're sending multiple signals at the same time, right? So one of these signals or multiple of these signals can be something that you know what's in there already. It's not data, it's just, for example, just a sine wave in a known frequency, just something that you know. And then when you're reading that information, you can basically know what the information should be in those places. And when you read that and it's different, you can basically compute, okay, what happened to that information so it's coming out different now, right? So you can know both like in terms of, oh, the signal is being reduced by attenuation, or like there's some weird effects that can also happen where signals at different frequencies are being attenuated at different levels. And then that sort of like creates a squished signal or a smooshed signal, right? And you can create multiple of those. They are called traveling pilots. Multiple of those at multiple different frequencies, and then you can basically understand how the shape of your signal changed when it was transmitted across the medium.
Thank you.
Way up the back.
Something I don't understand about QAM is how do you determine if a sine wave is the sine or the cosine? How do you lock that phase to begin with?
Ooh, so you mean like when you're doing the reading of the signal?
Yes.
Right. So the way it works is a bit interesting. It's based on sort of like all the, if you want to look into the math later, like you look into convolution and that kind of thing. But the basic idea is just you have your signal. You do like, let's go back from the beginning actually. So you have the two different sides, you multiply one by cosine, the other one by sine, you sum them together, you get some signal, right? Now you wanna know what was in there in the first place. The way that you do it is very simple, is you get that signal and you just multiply it again by a cosine and the other one by a sine. And that's going to give you an approximation of what the original values are. But it's not going to be perfect. You're going to get like, it's going to be basically, if it was a 1 there before, it's going to be like a waving 1, essentially. And then you pass that through some filters, you get the 1 back. But yeah, if you want to look into the math later, look into convolution and that kind of thing.
All right.
Just a bit curious, is this by any chance related to the fast Fourier transformation? Because it seems similar.
It is in multiple ways, especially the thing about OFDM. So fundamentally, the way that OFDM works is it's actually a Fourier transform, right? So yes, very much related. And if you are getting to OFDM, it's just a fast Fourier transform, yeah.
With that synchronization thing again, like, so what if you sampled it at like a 90 degrees phase difference again? So then you'd have like the cosine, when you multiply it by a sine, it would look like a cosine, right? So how do you differentiate between both of them then if you sample it like 90 degrees phase difference?
Yep. So that, because of that, it's very important to have that there's something called coherence, and it's very important to have synchronized signals when you're dealing with Wi-Fi or any kind of radio signal that actually uses this stuff. There are multiple ways that you can deal with, but basically what you do is sort of you phase lock the two systems. So you are always like, you can never like do the decoding at a 90-degree angle, otherwise you get the incorrect information. So before you send any information, you need to make sure like either have very accurate clocks on board of both systems, or you send some form of like pilot signal that allows you to initialize a specific instant in time and then do like your decoding in a synchronized way. But that's one of the main drawbacks of like any kind of system that uses this kind of thing.
Do we have any more questions? Oh, hey.
Are there Wi-Fi systems these days that use visible light? Because I've heard of a thing called Li-Fi, which kind of lights the room while it's doing the Wi-Fi thing. Is that? Can you talk about that?
Not like actual Wi-Fi. There are sort of like, and by actual Wi-Fi I mean not something that was like written in the standard. But if you look into research papers, there are people doing, for example, headlights on cars and doing actual like Wi-Fi protocol communication using those headlights, and a bunch of other things like for maritime signals, but there is no like broad application Wi-Fi like visible light communication.
Okay.
How bright would my Wi-Fi antenna be if it was a 500 nanometer LED?
Well, the usual power on Wi-Fi systems range from like 20 dBm to 30 dBm. So that's like at most 1 watt. I'm not exactly sure how bright that looks, but yeah, it would be a 1 watt LED.
All right, do we have any more questions? Oh, hey.
So the choice of frequencies in practice, we have the 2.4 and 5 gigahertz, except that these are the free range bands. Is there any other reason behind?
The different frequencies?
Yeah.
There are 2 main reasons, possibly a few others, but the 2 most important ones is first, this OFDM thing basically makes you use a bunch of different frequencies, right? So the more frequencies that you want to use, the more frequencies you need to be to have available. So if you're using like 1 hertz, you cannot go like below 0 hertz, right? So your space to one side is basically between 0 hertz and 1 hertz. If you're using 2.4 gigahertz, you can use anything from 0 to 2.4 to over 2.4, right? So the first reason is just if you want to have more of those waves at the same time, usually you need a higher frequency so you can have a higher what we call bandwidth. So for example, in 2.4, it's common to have like 40 megahertz and 80 megahertz systems. If you go much further up, you get bigger channels. And with those bigger channels, you can get like wider and more information at the same time. That's one. Second thing that you have different things is, for example, you have a 5G Wi-Fi system, right? If you put it in this room and you go into the next room, your signal is actually going to be much lower than if you had a 2.4 gigahertz Wi-Fi. Because the higher the frequency, the more it gets reflected by stuff and everything else. So yeah, those are the 2 main reasons you have like different frequencies. One is like sometimes you want the higher penetration, you cannot get like the higher bandwidth, but sometimes you do want the higher bandwidth and you lose a bit on penetration. So it's a bit of a balancing game.
All right, do we have time for one more question? No? If anyone here is feeling a little bit lost, be reassured this was just a 4th year engineering telecommunications subject. So it's okay. It's also the middle of the afternoon and we're about to go into a break and then into lightning talks this afternoon. So please join with me in thanking Felipe.